welcome everyone to the Fay Gale Lecture for 2017, the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia Annual Lecture. What Matters in Social Change, the Uncertain Significance of Caring by Professor Chris Beasley. I'm Professor Vivienne Moore, and with Associate Professor Megan Wearin, I co-direct the Fay Gale Centre for Research on Gender. And we would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with country. We acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and know that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present. It's my great pleasure to invite Professor Anne Edwards, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, to address the guests on behalf of the Academy. Now, I know that some of Anne's told me we're all friends here, she knows many people, but it's worth reminding you that following an academic career as a sociologist, Professor Edwards was Vice-Chancellor of Flinders University between 2001 and 2007. And she's since then taken up a number of board positions, including Chair of the Board of ANROSE, the Australian National Centre for Research on Women's Safety, President of the Council of Ageing in South Australia, Deputy Chair of the Australian Centre for Innovation, Co-Chair of the South Australian Premier's Council for Women, and she's a member of the Australian Health Ethics Committee of the National Health and Medical Research Council. You just need that lightly, and if you just hold that.
Fine, thanks very much. Well, I might come round here since I've got to read some stuff about the Academy that I haven't memorised before I got here. Yes, well, nice to see you all. You could have come a bit further to the front, but never mind. First, I should say it was a privilege to be asked to speak for the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia at this particular event, our only annual lecture named after a woman. And which honours an enormously respected woman academic leader, Fay Gale, a social geographer who gained a major international reputation for her research before becoming one of the first 2 women vice-chancellors in Australia and later president of our academy. She, of course, had very strong connections with Adelaide before and after going to Perth, as does our lecturer today, Chris Beasley, and as do I. I'm actually here on behalf of Peter Sperrett, who's the chair of the relevant committee of the Academy, but I think because I know people, he asked me if I would do the job of doing a bit of promotional work for the Academy, so I'll do that in a moment. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. So my role today is to say something about the Academy of Social Sciences, for some of you who may not know all that much about it, except that it starts with the name Academy, and to remind us all of the background to the Fay Gale Lecture, which is why we're here now. So the Academy is now getting close to 50 years old. It was established in 1971, but it succeeded a previous body, the Social Science Research Council, which was set up in 1942. But I imagine that its 50th birthday will be a reason for some special celebrations coming up fairly soon, 3 or 4 years' time. It's one of our 4 learned academies, which are formally recognised by the Commonwealth Government, the others being the Academy of Science, the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. But some of you may now know we have 2 newer academies in law and in health and medical sciences, which have been founded by academics in those disciplines, are not yet part of the Learned Academies structure, but may or may not join at some point in the future. The Academy comprises an interdisciplinary body of 591 scholars who have achieved significant scholarly distinction in one of the many social sciences disciplines that are part of our academy. And I think we claim that we've probably got more really distinct and different disciplines than the other academies do. We're probably closest to science in terms of the range when you're looking at subfields as well as major disciplines, but certainly it's an extremely diverse body. In 2017, the Academy's elected 46 new fellows. Equal numbers of men and women have been elected in this round. Now, the gender balance has been a major issue for some time, and over the last 10 years, we have seen a much more equal number of new fellows, though age remains a major factor that, of course, influences the overall gender breakdown. But we are seeing a significant shift. Unfortunately, we're up against longevity, which means at the other end, there are an awful lot of people who joined a long time ago when it was predominantly a male academy, so we have to just wait. But in the meantime, we're putting through, much more equal numbers. I should say the Academy is very much committed to diversity along all dimensions, and there's a lot of campaigning now, not only to balance on gender, but to bring in people at earlier stages of their career, and also to look at people from other national backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds. So we've got some way to go to achieve the values of the Academy, which are about diversity. Now, the mission or the purpose, I've rephrased it so I can't call it the mission because that's actually their own words, but the purpose of the Academy is to promote excellence in the social sciences in Australia and in the use of the social sciences through research, teaching, commentary and policy advice, and through collaboration between social scientists and other disciplines in Australia and with social scientists in other countries. Now, this lecture fits within the Academy's Public Forums programme, which is at the moment chaired by Peter Sperrett. And the Public Forums programme essentially runs events. That's what it chiefly does, in order to raise the awareness of the social sciences outside the Academy, as well as extend the knowledge and involvement of fellows within the Academy. So the events that are run are the annual symposium and the Cunningham Lecture, which this year are being held in Adelaide between October the 18th and 20th this year, which is a very significant departure from the usual practice, which is to meet in Canberra. So those of us who are members of the Academy are very keen that this will be successful. Interestingly, it's also being run jointly with the new Academy for Health and Medical Sciences, with a focus on health equity. But we also have a series of public lectures, one of which, of course, is the Fay Gale Lecture. The others are the Paul Burke Lecture, the Keith Hancock Lecture, and the Peter Carmel Lecture in Public Policy, all named after eminent male fellows. So the Fay Gale is the only one which is named after an eminent female academic. We also have a state fellows initiatives, and I'm pleased to say that the South Australian fellows are by far the liveliest of the groups across the country. We meet regularly, we give papers to each other, and several of our active members are here tonight, including Carol, who you'll hear from shortly. So that's the relevant part of the Academy, which is responsible for the lecture that we're here tonight. So now let's just turn to the Fay Gale and the lecture itself. So it's named after, obviously, named after the late Professor Fay Gale. Her full name was Gwendolyn Fay Gale. She lived between 1932 and 2008. She was the first honours graduate in geography from the University of Adelaide and went on to become an eminent human and social geographer. She's well known for her contributions to academia, the advancement of women within academia, Indigenous studies and juvenile justice. In 1990, she took up the position of Vice-Chancellor of the University of Western Australia, the second woman Vice-Chancellor in Australia, and she served there till 1997. She was also a very significant figure in the higher levels of university education in Australia, and is much regarded for her roles there on behalf of women, but a whole range of other significant changes in the way in which universities saw themselves and their role in the community. She received the Order of Australia in 1989 for her contribution to the social sciences, particularly the geography and Indigenous studies. In 1978, she was elected to the Academy, and she served as the Academy's first female president for the period 1997 to 2000. In honour of her contributions both to the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and the wider social science field, the Academy supports a distinguished female social scientist to present the annual Fay Gale Lecture. And the lecture is held this year in it's held in two locations, the lecturer's home university and in Adelaide at the Fay Gale Centre for Research in Gender. Sorry, I should give you a full title, the Fay Gale Centre for Research in Gender. So tonight's presentation is the second for the two in 2017, the first of which was held at the University of Sydney in conjunction with Sydney Ideas in late June. So the lecture will be video recorded and will be available on the Academy and Adelaide University websites. Now I would like to invite Vivian back. So unpick me.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that background to the lecture. I would now like to invite Professor Carol Johnson to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Well, it's with great pleasure that as a long-standing colleague of Chris's in both the Fay Gale Centre and in the Department of Politics and International Studies in this university, and also as a member of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, that I am here to introduce Chris tonight. Chris is a particularly appropriate person to present this Academy Fay Gale Lecture, given her important role in giving public recognition to Fay Gale's work and in her own right as an internationally renowned scholar concerned with socio-political theory, gender and sexuality, welfare state and care provision, and media analysis. Chris founded and then was co-director of the Fay Gale Centre for Research on Gender, and it is quite an accomplishment to get a centre set up at this university, believe me, so it was quite an extraordinary accomplishment on her part. An interdisciplinary research centre with a membership of over 50 academics at all levels, focused upon gender analysis, inaugurated in Fay Gale's name and with the support of Fay Gale's family. Chris Beasley's prestige as an international scholar is evidenced by the fact that she has been invited to provide keynote addresses in Sweden, Italy, Spain, Australia and Canada, and invited to undertake a range of invited and fully funded visiting scholar professorships in the UK, Australia and Sweden. She is on the editorial board of key international journals and book series. Indeed, I'd argue that Chris's work exemplifies the critical interventions which Australian feminist thinkers have made to international debates on key social science questions. She has produced over her career so far 4 books, plus one more forthcoming, 2 edited collections in addition to numerous book chapters and journal articles. And it's a few words about her books that I'd particularly like to give now. Chris's first book, Sexual Economists, Conceiving a Feminist Economics, was absolutely path-breaking, I'd suggest, in terms of its analysis of emotional work, care and economics, issues which now are only once again beginning to be taken up, but Chris's work was actually absolutely path-breaking in that regard. Her book, What is Feminism? An Introduction to Feminist Theory, will be well known to many of you because it's a crucial work with literally hundreds of citations that's used around the world in teaching as well as research. There are numerous times internationally where people have said to me, oh, you're from the University of Adelaide, isn't that where Chris Beasley comes from? They sometimes say, isn't that where Carol Backey comes from too? But they also say, isn't that where Chris Beasley comes from? I was like, yes, it is. In addition to that, Chris Beasley has also produced her book on gender and sexuality, Critical Theories, Critical Thinkers, which once again I'd suggest was path-breaking in terms of incorporating its cutting-edge work on both gender and sexuality, and once again is a book that has literally hundreds of citations. Her more recent book that she co-authored, including with Heather Brooke, who's here tonight, on heterosexuality in theory and practice, was similarly a cutting-edge work in that heterosexuality is so rarely actually analysed. A bit like whiteness, it's often taken for granted as the mainstream sexual identity category, and the work that Chris Beasley and her co-authors did in analysing heterosexuality really was highly original and innovative. I'm therefore really looking forward to the latest book she's got coming out, the one she's written with Heather Brooke on the cultural politics of popular film, power, culture and society, is one I'm really looking forward to. And I mean, it would also, I think, as well as be very interesting, it might also actually give a chance for some escapist enjoyment as well as some in-depth analysis, and heaven knows we need some escapist enjoyment at the present, but there'll also be deep-seated political analysis, I know, because I've gone to various seminars that Chris has actually given on it. And there's also, after that, a new book that she's written with Mary Holmes called Internet Dating that will hopefully be coming out in the not too far distant future as well. As well as these key books that I've mentioned, I might add that Chris also has some particularly well-known articles, and for example her article Rethinking Hegemonic Masculinity in a Globalising World once again has had hundreds of citations and made very interesting and innovative insights in the area of masculinity studies. And she also wrote a keynote essay for a symposium in Men and Masculinities on rethinking hegemonic masculinity in a globalising world, which similarly has hundreds of citations and is a major contribution to the literature. But tonight, Chris is going to be building on a whole lot of the work actually which I've discussed and pulling together some central themes in her work to be discussing what matters in social change, the uncertain significance of caring. And I'm delighted to introduce such an outstanding international scholar to you, and I'm looking forward very much to listening to her presentation. So thank you, Chris.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much to the Academy of Social Sciences for this invitation to give the annual Fay Gale lecture this evening, and of course to Professor Anne Edwards for coming this way to introduce the event. And thanks also to Professor Carol Johnson for her very thoughtful and very generous remarks to welcome me here tonight, and to Professor Vivienne Moore for her emceeing, and various other people within the Fay Gale Centre for Research on Gender who've done lots of work to set this up. And of course I thank too the University of Adelaide for hosting the event and my contribution to it. And lastly, thank you to all of you for being here tonight, especially since it's been such terrible weather. Okay, so what is the central intention of my lecture this evening? My central concern in this paper is to theorise social change. I do this initially by employing the feminist critique of major theories, the prevalent theories of social relations in modernity, a critique which gives very pivotal significance to care. And that feminist critique is then itself reconsidered, because by that means I hope to raise some uncertainties about exactly what is vital to social change. In particular, I would like to raise uncertainties about the place of caring and of caring emotional bonds in analysis of social change, because that is one aspect of feminist work that stays with us today. So, what do I want to do? How am I going to organise it? I need to go backwards and forwards because I want you to be able to sit in the middle here. The paper is in 3 parts. First of all, I want to give you a very broad outline of the wide-ranging international literature on accounts of sociality in late Western, some people would say Northern, modernity. That is a macro-scale literature which foregrounds the spread of competitive instrumentalist individualism, the so-called individualisation thesis. So this is an account of what happens in modernity. Then I want to indicate the limits of that literature from a feminist perspective, from a perspective that is critically attentive to gender hierarchy and to the term care. The affective character of care is deployed to acknowledge and also to enable resistance to individualisation. And so by that means, feminist commentators are demonstrating the importance of care and caring emotional to social change. So they're critical of that mainstream account, the individualisation thesis, and they use care to do that. The second part is then to say, okay, looks as if they're raising, feminist commentators are making some important points there using care, but that discussion raises some questions for me about the kind of weight that we should put on care and upon the emotions concerned with care. And as a result, I then turn to another, an alternative kind of position, which is to say that care may not always offer resistance to individualisation and I use some instances to say there are things which we might be critical about the character of care. I'm drawing here upon pro-feminist men and masculinity scholarship to explore potential uncertainties about the place of care and caring emotional bonds in social change. So I'm saying, okay, we start with the modernisation as individualisation, as individualism approach, then we go to the feminist critique, then we say, well, maybe the feminist critique might have some problems too, and then from there I move to the third part, which is to say, okay, if we can see some problems with the care analysis, perhaps we need to reconsider both the literature from men and masculinity scholars and from feminist scholarship on care to suggest an alternative direction regarding what really might matter in generating change in modern social life, what is vital to it, to that change. So there are 3 steps, in other words. The first is to say, well, let's have a look at care significance. To show care significance. The second is to place that significance in some doubt to make it less certain. And the third is to say, I think we need to suggest another direction. So that's the sort of staging of it. Right, so let's get to the modernity as individualisation thesis and the critiques of it. A range of scholars have developed macro accounts of social life and social change, which register new prevailing modes of sociality in modern societies. And these accounts of late modernity, despite rather different political agendas, offer a vision for us of sweeping changes, which can be summarised as an overall shift to individualisation. They assert that this is crucial to the change that heralds modernity. Individualisation is what is characteristic of modernity. The problem is that they often show a really decidedly limited grasp of gendered power relations and of their ongoing impact. Feminist scholarship has a different perspective and envisages an alternative direction for social life. Indeed, I think an alternative socio-political imaginary from that associated with the modernity as individualisation thesis. So the challenge for feminist scholarship is to bring a gender perspective to analysis of possible changes in modern social life. Care comes to figure in feminist responses as a powerful means for resisting individualisation. Because of this, while care is a terminology that we would know is employed in all sorts of settings and in all sorts of ways, I'm going to specifically employ the feminist conception of the meaning of care in this paper, along with the strong associations that feminist commentators have between care and emotional bonds. So I'm going to use that kind of terminology. I have outlined the meaning of care in feminism in various publications, and I'm also going to refer to it a bit later in this paper. So at this point I'm just going to be quite brief. For now, I'm simply going to note that the feminist usage of the language of care typically draws upon an ontology and an ethico-political stance which affirms embodied and affective relationality. Care, indeed, occupies a central space in feminist theorising and activism, arguably a more central and significant space than in most socio-political theory and social movements. It has a really particular place in feminism. For example, by contrast, care as against justice, for example, may not always be that central to anti-racist approaches and struggles. Care may have a different positioning. In feminism, it has a really key significance because, first of all, feminism foregrounds interconnection as against, the atomistic sovereign mind in shaping what it is to be human. So it's interconnection is seen in the feminist literature as shaping what makes human nature. And in this context, the feminist focus on care locates the organisation also of how specifically we become human. It locates its concern with material circumstances, with the bodily, social and historical circumstances of how we become human. So in this context, the feminist focus on care is really importantly directed towards thinking about caring work and the gendered character of that care, because it indicates that care is unavoidably central to sociality and therefore to social change. Care signals what is human and how specifically we are made human. So this stance is really, you can see, very different from the modernity as individualisation thesis. Very different understanding of social life. So let's now turn to the late modernity individualisation thesis, because this is the predominant contemporary way of understanding what's happened in terms of social life and social change. There is a really extensive literature now which outlines the present state of sociality, of social connection and closeness between people in Western or Northern late modernity. And the major accounts of what characterises our modern social life can be briefly summarised as I have in these two broad camps that you can see on that PowerPoint slide. We've got the modernisation promoters and we've got the modernisation critics. And what I'm going to do is to give you a quick outline of each of the four. There are two under each. And I'll outline each version, and then I'll give you a quick version of the feminist critique of those versions and how care is used in that critique. So, to the first one, the modernisation promoters. The modernisation promoters are positively embracing what is seen as the sort of rise of individualistic neoliberal social modes of practice and subjectivities, which are described as mirroring competitive atomism and the efficiencies of market exchanges. And as an example, universities are social organisations, as we know, which are increasingly urged by those who accept the notion of the neoliberal academy to strive for individualised, competitive, cognitive betterment amongst academics, many of you here, who are to be measured and ranked upon that basis. And indeed for universities themselves as institutions to be measured and ranked as they strive to advance corporate revenue production. Now, you may well be aware, but in response to this, there's been a vast body of interdisciplinary work that's arisen on neoliberalism's negative impact upon organisations like universities, as well as upon their social interactions and the subjectivities of people within universities. Concerns about the embrace of the neoliberal ascendancy, of course, rather vary. Commentators sometimes will concede the hegemonic reach of neoliberal perspectives, but they may challenge the extent to which that has been taken in terms of hegemonic control over subjects. Whatever the viewpoint, these concerns, for example, in relation to institutions like universities, are frequently linked to feminist critical perspectives which uphold the ongoing significance of social connection and voice concerns and even antagonism to social hierarchy. So in this context, feminist concerns about well-being, about the negative consequences of this kind of competitive individualism within the neoliberal academy amount to care-oriented approaches, care-based models of sociality, a model typically entwined with some awareness of the problems associated with gender inequality. So care-based responses become a means to developing analytical and practical responses, strategies of resistance. So we can see here how you get a particular account of what's happening in modernity and a feminist critique using care. The other main group of supporters of individualising modernity, another group of modernisation promoters, tend to focus much more specifically upon the positive possibilities of individualisation, not so much for organisations, but more for intimate relationality and subjectivities. For example, you probably have heard these names, Anthony Giddens and Ulrich Beck, both offer macro-scale theories which assert that late modern societies are characterised by weak social bonds. Individuals are as a result able to float free of the ties of traditional societies and fixed social roles, and hence from restrictive gender assumptions. And by this means they're able to embark, you may not have realised this, but you've been embarking upon your own self-reflexive, personalised projects. So you're all becoming individualised, and you're able to move in ways that you float free from traditional fixed roles. Late modernity, in other words, in this model, as well as in the neoliberal ascendancy literature, is promoted as enabling a brave new world of pure choice, individual pure choice, importantly. Now, as you can imagine, this sort of approach has also been subjected to criticism by feminist commentators who draw attention to our ongoing, embedded, affective, emotional connections, if you like, between people. And so there are claims about caring bonds and about associated emotions between us, which are put forward to make an account of resistance to ambitious assumptions about individualisation. And here, once again, the idea of care is often aligned in feminist perspectives with challenging any simple triumphant theorisations regarding modernisation. So then we get the modernisation critics. Now, the modernisation critics tend to be a little bit less happy and perhaps more in common with feminist criticisms of modernity, but I'll run you through how care is used here too. The modernisation critics bemoan the losses that they associate with modernity, and in the process they offer us two versions of what Hookway describes as moral decline thinking. That is cultural pessimism and communitarianism. In the case of cultural pessimism, epitomised by commentators like Reif, Lash and Bell, there's a shared nostalgia about the loss of traditional religious and paternal authority in the face of what is described as the moral impoverishment of modern culture. Such conservative commentators are dismayed at what they see as the loss of modes of social repression and discipline, which will leads to the consequent collapse into an amoral and, very importantly, an uncaring world, it is argued. So while you can see some obvious feminist criticisms of this kind of approach concerning, the gendered character of upholding traditional authority, nevertheless, care's potential as a language of resistance to individualisation in modernity is also here evident. The communitarians, well, they're somewhat less inclined to catastrophic visions of the present. They're not quite as inclined to say it's all going to shit. But I shouldn't share that. Anyway, whatever. Move along. Nevertheless, they share with cultural pessimists a sense of the substantial dangers of a waning moral consensus, in their view, resulting not so much from a loss of that traditional authority, but from weakened community. So instead of the loss of top down, we're losing this kind of connection this way, the horizontal connections. The communitarian writers, however, often appear to be quite nostalgic about the unselfish community and familial connections and care, which were and still are largely upheld by traditional models of femininity and women's labour. Even so, here once again, care gets to be the means by which feminist concerns about the direction of social life can arise. you can see the ways in which care is still there used as a critique. So, to sum up, that feminist critique of the modernity as individualisation thesis and the use of care. The overarching point of that very brief summary of a considerable body of literature is that both the positive and the negative accounts of the modernity as individualisation thesis, that's what modernity is, what change has been about, have significant implications for feminist theorising. All of them, all four of them, despite their very different social visions, their different political agendas, offer accounts of social change in which gender hierarchy is now passé, because in modernity, individuals rule. All of them typically show a really decidedly limited grasp of gendered power and its ongoing significance, presuming that individualisation is universal, experienced in a disembodied, gender-neutral fashion. So in case you hadn't noticed, you're all being individualised, at the same rate, everywhere, no matter what your background, no matter whether you're men or women, doesn't make any difference. Everyone's being individualised. So, for example, Beck and Beck-Gernsheim assert that people are being released from the constraints of gender and axes of socially organised difference, such that their activities are more a matter of individual decisions. So I hope you're recognising your individuality here tonight. Hence, although some feminist scholars have made use of elements of two of the approaches, I'll just go back to show you, the transformative reflexive modernisation one, and on the other side the communitarian one. So there has been some use by feminists of these two literatures. Nevertheless, the feminist commentators do tend to remain at something of a distance from these various versions of the individualisation thesis. Indeed, as I've outlined, feminist perspectives are often the ones that are really precisely mobilised in critiques of that thesis. In particular, within these feminist perspectives, care is very frequently invoked as a resistant mode, as indicating another conception of what sociality is and what modern sociality is in particular. As I indicated earlier, feminist usage of care is notable, I think, for insisting upon the irreducible sociality of us all, that we all are connected to one another. For the deployment of a gender contextualised language, certainly, which highlights the importance of social interconnection to well-being and also draws attention to ongoing, particularised and embodied emotional bonds and obligations between us. Care in these contexts provides a platform, I think, for a feminist political imaginary, an alternative political imaginary, an alternative understanding of society and of change. Care, in this sense, comes to figure in two important ways. It provides the means to work against the idea of individualisation, to resist it, to say this should not be the way we go forward. But also it does it resists individualisation as a sort of rhetoric, as a political imaginary, as a social practice. But it also is a terminology that's used to dispute the assumed actuality of a universal, gender-neutral hegemony of individualisation. So it's a means to work against it and say, we're not going down that path, but it's also a means to say, you think it's everywhere, but it's actually not as much as you think. So it's a quite interesting combination there. So the use of care in feminist perspectives provides quite an alternative. And I want to use just 3 examples to give you, because sometimes these are sort of very rhetorical statements, so perhaps we need some practical instances to get our heads around what this might mean. 3 examples I'm going to use are illustrative, I think, of the usefulness of care. So this is all me saying all the usefulness of care for feminist approaches to modern sociality. They illustrate the importance of caring and emotional bonds, and therefore of how to theorise social change in another way. The first is the use of the language of care by Swedish scholars who argue against the ascendancy of a neoliberal focus upon measurable, documented aspects of the preschool teaching, preschool management. these Swedish scholars resist pressures to assert that preschooling should be understood in terms of things you can write down. How many times do the kids learn to go to the toilet without wetting themselves? How many times do they learn certain new words or write new words? How many times, you know, that sort of stuff. Resisting that kind of idea. They argue that care is what preschools are really about. This terminology provides them with a means to understand what preschool teachers, they say, are actually doing. They say preschool teachers are doing care and that that's crucial, and what these teachers should be putting value upon. The second instance is an example of the use of language in relation, of care in relation to dementia. A lot of commentators in the UK, Australia and elsewhere have employed care as a way to face increasing neoliberal pressures towards marketisation of healthcare and particularly the management of biomedical commodification of ageing. As Barnes and Branley put it, care becomes a very interesting language to work against individualist, consumerist models of health services, which is something that I feel increasingly close to, of course. They say the re-emergence of a concern with the value base of social and health care practices and policies, that is the care orientation, can be considered as a reaction to the dominance of managerialism within human service organisations. So again, it's being used in a particular way to resist certain kinds of pressures. A third instance arises in the approach taken by political theorist Isabel Laurie in her book State of Insecurity, Government of the Precarious, 2015. She argues, a very interesting book, that late modernity is marked by precarisation. Terribly difficult word to say, precarisation, an existence in which insecurity becomes the means to perpetuate domination. In this setting, she introduces the example of the Madrid-based research collective Precarias a la Deriva, which has developed a care community focusing upon personal affective relationality between people who share a precarious existence, as a means to stand up to a whole range of government interventions and all sorts of uncertainties about jobs and so on. So those three practical instances, I think, provide support for that general analytical point that care as a vocabulary of social interconnection, of emotional bonds, can provide resistance to the idea of modernity as individualisation. Such instances are also supported by a wide range of other literatures, interdisciplinary scholarship, which, for example, confidently will assert that feminist-inflected ethics of care provide the opportunity to interrogate relationships of power and therefore is capable of advancing a more morally just social world. That's from a new book on care ethics in social work, an instructional kind of manual about the importance of care. In a more generalised but related vein, you get a variety of writers recently engaged in developing what is called the affective turn in the humanities and social sciences, including scholars as varied as Norbert Elias, Ali Hochschild, Richard Avramenko and Sara Ahmed, who have all insisted that emotions, including emotional motivations shaped by care such as responsibility and courage, should be taken seriously in considering social relations and change. So we have a wide variety of literatures which show some basis for saying that there is solid support for feminist deployment of care as a means to challenge accounts of social change enunciated by those who would put forward the individualisation thesis. Okay, looks, very solid. Nevertheless, the feminist approach, it seems to me, remains somewhat unspecific when considering what might be decisive about substantive change, for producing substantive change. And in particular, it seems to me, could presume too much concerning the importance of care and caring emotions. And this, of course, is very interesting for me to be arguing because I've been writing about care for a very long time. So, let's get to now the second part where we're going, okay, well, what could be problematic about care? What could be its uncertainties? I do think it's very important, of course, to acknowledge the contribution of care in challenging the hegemony of an individualising neoliberalism. I think that is undoubtedly there. Nevertheless, in certain respects, caring and caring emotional bonds, in my view, provide an uncertain basis for social change. In particular, I want to argue that care offers a restricted ethico-political starting point for the feminist agenda of envisaging an alternative sociality. Since I've outlined that view in a number of pieces of previous work, sometimes with Carol Backey, who was to be here today but she's sick, but sometimes also on my own, here I'm going to be quite concise about the problematic aspects of care before I turn again to some examples. So I gave you some examples of the positives and I'll try and give you some examples of the negatives. So, just to say why I might begin to be uncertain. And it first of all arises in relation to care's implication in existing social hierarchy. A quick run through the care thinkers. Early care thinkers within feminism tend to see care as a moral disposition, as a sort of a virtue, a personal virtue that you might have, that you're a caring person. And of course the hierarchical nature of lots of caring relationships, including mothering, in that analysis went a bit unnoticed. But even more recent versions, which focus on care not as an individual personal quality, but as a social institutional practice of the welfare state, there is a moral and asymmetrical relationship constructed between those needing care and those delivering care, which I think continues to undermine the egalitarian potential of the terminology. That distinction, which I am concerned about, between the needy and those attending to their needs, appears also in related recent material, as in a range of recent postmodern attempts to ground a new ethical sociality around the social relations of care. For example, in the work of Emmanuel Levinas, he doesn't use the word care, but his focus on our responsibility and our compassion for the other actually replicates the concerns of many care ethicist scholars. Displaying some related ideas, people like Margaret Shildrick and a range of others engage with the language of vulnerability, and probably this is language you're familiar with too. There is a democratising concern in those sorts of writings in their focus on responsibility for and the vulnerability of the other. This kind of language gets used in relation, for example, to asylum seekers. Nevertheless, like other care-oriented thinkers, Levinas assumes a really radical asymmetry between the carer and those who require care. Similarly, in the vulnerability scholarship, the emphasis upon the bodily needs and the possibility of the suffering of the other, making unavoidable claims upon those of us who are required to help them. In summing up, what I see here as problems is in these care-inflected approaches, despite some differences, whether they locate care as a personal, individual moral quality, a disposition, a social practice of the welfare state, or a postmodern responsibility towards the vulnerable other. The caring exchange is viewed consistently as a form of altruism. And you might go, well, Chris, excuse me, what is the problem with altruism? There's little enough of it. Surely there is no difficulty with such a thing. Well, care ethicists and many associated writers can certainly, I think, be credited with offering a critique of that rational, atomistic self-citizen associated with neoliberalism in their emphasis upon an embodied, affective, altruistic politics. However, the asymmetry at the heart of the political vision of care ethics in important ways tends to leave in place that autonomous subject citizen of neoliberalism, who is to be distinguished from the dependency of the other. There's a built-in hierarchical character in altruism, which means that care doesn't necessarily destabilise power relations and inequality, but may rather be implicated in them. And given this, it's not surprising that caring and emotional bonds cannot necessarily be located on the side of progressive social change. And so some examples. What could be some problems with care? I'm going to turn to research on men and masculinities. I'll first of all focus on homosociality, relations between men. Recent perspectives on Western or Northern masculinities assert that traditional and or hegemonic conceptions of and enactments of masculinities are in transition. So I hope all the men in the room are aware that they're in transition. Eric Anderson, for example, proposes the development of what he calls a new inclusive masculinity by reference to his research on various elite, various male athletes, not elite athletes, non-elite athletes, specifically in England and in the US. The rise of an inclusive masculinity is described in terms of heterosexual men demonstrating emotional and physical proximity. I don't know why I was doing that, but anyway, you understand the point. Anderson and his co-authors assert, for instance, that homosocial intimacy has become normative among British male youth. His emphasis, normative. In several works, Anderson also claims that what he views as a marked rise in the acceptance of homosocial, tactile and emotional proximity is associated with a respect for women, will produce decreased sexism and may even assist in the erosion of patriarchy. At the very least, he states that increasing homosocial intimacy appears to be associated with a lack of misogynist perspectives. Thus, the account of the rise of an inclusive masculinity is regarded as advancing gender equity. So in other words, he's putting forward a view that the new development of caring and emotional bonds is producing social change. Okay? Now, whether or not homosocial intimacy has in fact increased, in other words, even if Anderson's assertions regarding the growth of homosocial intimacy were accepted, my question would be, does this necessarily have an impact, an actual impact on gender hierarchy, a significant impact? Indeed, what's interesting about this mode of gender theorising, masculinity theorising, is its remarkable lack of attention to gendered power relations between men and women. Focuses almost exclusively on relations between men. And I note in this context that men and masculinity scholars like Raewyn Connell and James Messerschmidt, as well as Dimitrakis Dimitriou, amongst others, have specifically outlined points which encourage considerable caution regarding Anderson's claims and support my reservations about those claims. These writers point out that masculinities, including hegemonic masculinities, can incorporate or develop new features like increased emotionality, less homophobia, greater homosocial tactility, but that these may or may not shift masculine authority. Dimitriou, in keeping with Connell and Messerschmidt, insists that in practice, both incorporation and oppression can occur together. Dimitriou and Hennessy note that softening the rigid requirements of manhood can conceal ongoing gender inequality, projecting the convenient illusion that inequality is no longer an issue. So changing certain aspects of masculinity may appear as if it produces that gender inequality is not an issue anymore, but that may not be so. Indeed, Connell and Messerschmidt state quite emphatically that it is a mistake to treat the hierarchy of masculinities as logically continuous with the patriarchal subordination of women. He's saying, I think they are different. She's saying they're different. In this context, potential homosocial shifts between men could perhaps blur internal hegemony between men, might even blur gender difference, perhaps, but not necessarily undermine what Messerschmidt calls patriarchy, may not undermine male dominance. Anderson's work shows, in other words, a tendency to presume that one aspect of his micro-level analysis of relationality, that is emotional bonds, embodied emotional bonds, somehow trump social hierarchy, that caring forms of connection will trump social hierarchy, will produce other changes. And this assumption is also a feature of the men and masculinity scholarship concerning fatherhood. So there's this argument about the importance of caring that is how important it is to social change. Now we get quickly to fatherhood. As Klinth, Johansson, Han, Nordberg and many others have stated, Sweden has long had a national project concerned with the constitution of the new father, the involved father, as it's often put in Swedish. The national project is seen as drawing upon the ideal of gender equality and simultaneously constituting gender equal fatherhood and a gender equal man. But even if these assertions regarding the growth of this new involved father were accepted and could be empirically demonstrated by things like rising paternal care, my question once again would be, would this necessarily have an impact on gender hierarchy? Now, the link between involved fathering and gender equity does seem a little bit more realistic. You know, if your fathers are involved with their children, then there may be some impact in relation to gender hierarchical workloads. So you could see some link as against perhaps the less clear link between male intimate homosociality and gender equity. All the same, I suggest that it is not a given that increased caring and emotional connections between men and children, any more than increased connections between men, is straightforwardly engaged in changing the authority of masculine subjects or producing gender equity between men and women. It might have an effect, but I don't think it's necessarily the case. And in support of that assertion, I want to note 2014 research on violence against women by FRA, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, which is an organisation which did some work across 28 EU member states, including at that time the UK. The study found that Sweden was among the top countries in the EU in terms of reported violence against women. 46% of women responding to that survey in Sweden reported physical and or sexual violence, a slightly higher percentage than the UK and France, and higher than the EU average. Some commentators, of course, rushed in immediately, and especially the Swedish ones, and urged great caution, saying that Sweden may have a higher rate of reporting than many other countries. However, even if other countries' rates of violence against women may be understated, even if that is so, that does not make these Swedish figures disappear. They don't go away. Indeed, Lucas Gotzen has gone so far as to say that the Swedish gender equal man is a myth. The FRA figures certainly substantiate widespread violence against women. And my point here is that this research provides some pretty decided grounds for refusing any simple presumption that putatively greater involvement of men in nurturing children is necessarily aligned with progressive changes in the social status of masculinity or in power differentials between men and women. So summarising those difficulties, summarising what might be the case against care, if you like. The instances of homosociality and fatherhood suggest that the development of close relationships, growing intimacy, connection, embodied emotional practices, care for others on the part of men cannot be simply presumed to manifestly and incontrovertibly advance gender equity. As Odbury and Hedlund, amongst others, have indicated, embodied emotions precisely can indeed sustain and are indeed necessary to the sustainability of regressive subject positions and social relations, including regressive notions of masculinity, which contribute not to social change but social inertia. So it's not the case that regressive notions of manhood have no emotionality attached to them. They do. Care per se does not, it would seem, impel any certain diminution of social hierarchy, including gender hierarchy. Per se does not inevitably trump social hierarchy, is my point. And that's really quite important for the feminist argument. Caring about others, emotional feelings about others, compassion for others, altruism towards others may well be very important, but caring emotions aren't enough. While attention to extending and diversifying masculinity in relation to homosociality and to involved fatherhood may have some impact upon gender hierarchy, and I certainly hope it does, I suggest that it is necessary to give direct attention to gender relations between men and women if the aim is to generate change in relation to gender hierarchy. We need to pay attention directly to that question. In short, what that means is that what might crucially matter for social change from a feminist perspective is some caution about the significance of caring and caring emotions in combination with a robust re-engagement with the political. So, to an alternative position. I've said the care can be useful, I've said what could be problematic about it, so where to now? Such a perspective to me suggests two possible immediate questions: necessary re-engagement with the key insights of crucial men and masculinity scholars, as well as a re-engagement with some of the feminist literature concerning the value of care as against justice. So, to the first one, men and masculinity scholarship, how might that be reconsidered? I've noted that Raewyn Connell's approach and terminology around hegemonic masculinity raises significant doubts about whether shifts in features of masculinity will have any self-evident impact upon masculine authority or power relations between men and women. Indeed, Connell has continuously and specifically prioritised men's dominance over women in her analyses. She prioritises this over the organisation of masculinities. While Connell undoubtedly pays attention to emotional bonds, to cathexis, including those between men, the central core of Connell's approach is about the political, is about social hierarchy between men and women. And hence her account of hegemonic masculinity, that commonly used language, locates it first and foremost as a strategy for the subordination of women, something which she has suggested has been not noticed as much in recent times, in recent men and masculinities literature. Recognition of the limits of care and caring emotions in social change and an associated proposal to reignite focus upon power between men and women suggests to me that the feminist and the pro-feminist men and masculinities commentaries, which advocate moving on from or abandoning Connell's analytical work, might require a second look. Such commentaries are inclined to see Connell's work as maybe too constricting, as limited, as now outdated, and propose looking for other sources of theoretical inspiration. While critical discussion of Connell's work, of course, is necessary, and I have contributed to that work myself, there seem to me to be some powerful grounds for precisely returning to some of the key insights in that approach. Second, reassessment of what matters for social change from a feminist perspective has a number of further implications. Among these, I suggest a return to long-established feminist debates between weighing up the importance of care versus justice. Feminist commentators have commonly faulted traditional ethico-political thinking for approaching things, looking at issues, interests, subjectivities, modes of reasoning, which are associated with masculinity. Things like autonomy, objectivity, universality, rules, and so on. And the traditional account of this supposedly objective justice has been identified in those feminist approaches as dislocating human reasoning from interrelational connection. Instead, feminist approaches have put forward that care orientation to stress contextual understanding, emotion, and relational interconnection. So in other words, that feminist prioritisation of care tends to consequently locate justice as hanging off the coattails of care, if you like, behind. Virginia Held, for example, says things like care precedes justice, whereas justice does not requires care, and so care has to be the core ethical value within feminist thinking. More recently, of course, commentators haven't put quite a dichotomous view between care and justice, and they've tended to suggest other alternatives. Sometimes they've suggested that justice could be included in a larger conception of care, or sometimes, not so often, care is included in an expanded account of justice. But my point is that neither of those two accounts, those two options, takes into consideration the point that I've just made in this paper. In short, advancing social change for a just society may not be necessarily furthered by caring emotions. Care and justice, fairness, equity, may not be necessarily linked in the way that feminist commentators have long suggested. So, in conclusion, in summary, I've tried to reconsider all those mainstream prevalent accounts of social change by employing the feminist critique of those major analyses of modernity. And the feminist commentators, as I've pointed out, regularly challenge those analyses by reference to the affective character of care. Nonetheless, I argue that care as an effective system is not necessarily involved in undermining, let alone resisting, neoliberal trajectories of individualisation, but is indeed capable of reiterating them. This is exemplified by considering scholarship on innovations in masculinity, where the emergence of a more caring, more emotionally inflected practice does not inevitably counter gender hierarchy. My point there, in that kind of whole run of arguments, is to say that valorisation of care is not to be equated with a strategy for equality or justice. However, if care and caring emotions are not the, or perhaps even a, decisive lever for progressive social change, well then, theorising and strategy in feminism, in pro-feminist masculinity, meta-masculinity scholarship and beyond, really we need to think about some urgent adjustments. This is not, I wish to make very clear as a final set of remarks, a return to some notion of justice as an unemotional objectivity advocated in that traditional ethico-political thinking, or a reinstatement of assessments of care and justice as somehow antithetical. Not at all. I'm not suggesting that at all. The call to reanimate justice, to focus on power, does not require, I think, an alteration of feminist commitments, ontological and otherwise, to a notion of a human being's irreducible sociality. And it doesn't necessitate a retreat from social interconnection, ideas of social connection, going back to some sort of atomistic individualism. It doesn't require that at all. Nor is this approach a retreat from caring. It's certainly not an endorsement of being uncaring, implying withdrawal into political melancholia, as Rosie Braidotti puts it. Rather, instead of focusing on care, as we have indeed done for some time, I suggest a reanimated focus on justice. To Rosie Braidotti's call to a vital engagement in affirmative politics, I would add a prior attentiveness to power. And that is, I would add the call to a passionate affirmation of politics itself. And at a time when politics has become a synonym for all that is worthless, it seems to me that this is all the more important. Thank you.
Project the arc of the thinking was amazing.
I hope you could follow it.
We could. We have a very small amount of time for questions, because after questions we have drinks.
Very wise move.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm sorry I came in a little bit late, but you didn't say anything about economics or structural issues. I'm assuming that's where the politics has to be directed, because people can care, but a lot of the whole gender hierarchy in a way is buttressed by capitalism, the economic system.
I guess I wouldn't say that the things that, in talking about power, that immediately is the same thing as talking about economics. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I would certainly say that there are lots of things that might involve power, and that I'm not suggesting we don't attend to social interrelationships. But I guess what worries me is that there's been a long-standing tendency to use care as a way of argue that care can marshal all sorts of things that maybe it can't, and that we need to perhaps be a bit more careful about that. And that would certainly involve looking at economic power as one of the aspects of power, although it would not be the only one, for sure. Sorry, I hope that's a quick response.
More careful about care, I like that. Karen.
Chris, that was a tour de force as usual, lived up to all our expectations. I do have one question, however. At the end, I take your point about the need to analyse justice rather than perhaps focusing on care, but isn't it really the intersections between them that you need to actually look at, like what forms of care we're talking about? It reminds me a bit of when Martha Nussbaum was talking about empathy, and she says, well, you know, empathy by itself won't generate a positive politics. It might be that you're worrying about empathy for the wealthy because they can't afford to buy peacocks, can't police anymore, or whatever. And isn't it also a question of what type of care, like whether it's a form of care that involves a conception of justice that is about empathy, that is about looking after the vulnerable, or whatever?
I would certainly agree that caring will be in any kind of conception of justice, and I'm not suggesting, as I said, I'm not suggesting they're antithetical, not at all. I am saying I think the emphasis needs to shift, and that's the crucial part. And I think for a long time we have had a different approach to that, and a lot of those earlier debates have tended to make justice perhaps a lesser category, and I don't think we should stick with that. Yeah.
Listen, more a comment. Chris, I was thinking when you were talking about emotion, I mean, surely, like, you know, if you think of the history of colonialism or charitable, you know, I mean, care and emotion have always been there. I mean, it's you know, the hierarchy in which that caring takes place. So I don't think men and masculinity is the new man. I mean, this is just a new sort of resurgence of it, I suppose. But I think it's always had a problematic, you know, historically a problematic position of how you dispense emotion and dispense care.
Yeah, and I think certainly I am wanting to remind us of that, of the emotionalities of relationships in imperialism and in all sorts of places which have not been about social equity at all, and precisely the opposite. But I suppose that I'm even going back to Carol's point, even emotions where there is, you know, emotions that are supposedly more equitable, I guess what I'm saying is that I do think some of the Swedish literature is about, you know, kind of developing new kinds of conceptions of gender relations. But I am concerned that if the focus is upon caring alone, or perhaps primarily, that will tend to not make people think carefully about the power relations involved, and that might be where we need to go back to. I mean, it sounds like a kind of, you know, getting it seems a harsh thing to say at this particular time, to talk about, you know, perhaps the emphasis shouldn't be on care so much, but I think that's precisely why I feel the need to say it.
Katie, and we'll make this the last one.
It's really more of a comment. I think perhaps what is issue here is that a lot of care theory has been around suggesting that care is what we want to achieve, when really care is a tool in something else, which is justice. And so therefore, if we perhaps use the language of care and emotions more generally as tools that we use to achieve particular ends, then perhaps it might more usefully help us think about what those relations are.
I'm not quite sure, Katie. I mean, I take your point, but I'm not quite sure if care is the tool. I'm not quite sure about that. I'm less certain about that than perhaps I've ever been. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Professor Edwards and I would like to formally thank you. Handing someone a present to hand to us. Lovely. There's a nice aspect of the ritual. So
You've got to do your bit, apparently.
No, I'm just the embodiment of
the caring for me.
An embodied version of the academy, the male academy.
Oh my goodness me!
Changing.
They've got butterflies.
There we are. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
We're very mindful of the reporting we're going to have.
We've got all the colours here, except I've got this stupid thing on my chest, but never mind. Okay, thank you.
Really enjoyed me, and thank you.